Good evening and welcome to our fourth episode of the South African Equestrian Federation's podcast From the Horse's Mouth. I'm your host this evening. My name is Georgie Roberts, and tonight we are talking about equine anti-doping. And I found this really lovely quote which says, "The sad thing about doping is that it can not only obscure much of our appreciation for natural greatness, but also endangers the horses that we profess to love." So tonight, here in the studio with me, I'm very lucky to have Janine Turner, our LLB, and sitting on the Judicial Council of the SAEF, as well as Sheelagh Higgerty, who has a very impressive list of credentials. She's been a vet for 40 years. She's an FEI official and treating veterinarian in 6 disciplines. She is a chairperson of the SAEF's Veterinary Commission, a member of the South African Equine Veterinary Association Sport Horse Committee, and the National Head Veterinarian in South Africa for the FEI. For anyone who is eager to learn more about doping so that you don't get thrown out of the SAEF, I'm joking, but that could happen, please visit www.saef.org.za/clean sport. That link will be in the comments section, as well as I think the blurb of our podcast here tonight, and familiarize yourself with that, as well as, Janine, I believe it's the FEI's app that's available on the phone called Clean Sport.
Yes, it is. It is the FEI Clean Sport app, which is wonderful because it gives you a direct indication as to whether the medication that you're giving your horse or hoping to give your horse, whether it is a banned substance or a prohibited substance. Just note that you can't always just put in the medication itself. You have to put in the active ingredients.
Because so it's like I said to Sheelagh the other day, I was surprised because I thought paracetamol was the active ingredient in Panado, but internationally it can be known as acetaminophen. So
you actually have to put in the active ingredients. Sometimes you can put in the medication. So you could type in Previcox or Tildren or Metacam. It will give you the substance, but sometimes it won't. So it just depends. And I think it's always best to look at the active ingredients and maybe put them in to try and see. But there is an app. It's very easily available.
I think the difference is that most drugs, when they come out, there's a patent on them. And so it's
the brand name.
It's a brand name.
Okay.
But then after the period, which I think is something like 10 years, then any company can make that chemical substance. So then there's a whole lot of different brand names. So it would be...
the generics, basically, that become available.
Yes.
Okay.
It's like Meloxicam, and now there's Petcam, now there's Vetcam.
Okay.
So that you need to know what the active principle is.
Okay. So speaking tonight about, and last week we spoke about safe sport, and then this week we're focusing on clean sport. What are the latest changes to the equine anti-doping legislation within the SAEF? I know there's been a lot of, I don't want to say panic on the streets, or in the stables rather, but people discussing that now there's random drug testing happening around every corner, which shouldn't concern anyone. I just want to say.
No, it shouldn't, and hopefully it doesn't. I don't think there have been any changes, Georgie. The veterinary regulations have been in place for a while. And in terms of the veterinary regulations, we would always refer or defer to the FEI, Equine Anti-Doping Regulations. I think what's changed, and not necessarily changed, but the SAF has very much said we are now focusing on doing sampling and testing at various shows. So various shows have been identified. Sheelagh is very involved with deciding which shows, as well with the SAF, and the SAF has put aside a budget in order to do that.
And Sheelagh, is this across disciplines?
It's across
the
all
SAF?
disciplines, so it's not just the FEI disciplines.
Okay.
It would be mounted games, it would be saddle seat, it would be tent pegging, polo cross. And, one of the things about we going and doing it unannounced is that the fact that you never know what's going to happen is a huge deterrent in itself.
And the idea is that any of these disciplines that have signed on to the SAEF have agreed to the code of conduct and the welfare of the horse conduct.
Correct.
Okay.
And this is really important to be seen, because my experience is that it's a sort of belief that, well, I'm only jumping 1 meter, they're not going to test me. I don't think that should ever be an answer. You should never jump any horse on a substance, not just because it's a meter and they're not going to test you. The whole idea of doping is that it is a form of cheating, and you should not be subjecting your horse to have something like a painkiller so that it will go around and jump. You will be doing or could be doing an awful lot of harm to your own horse.
And I think that's really what the point is,
It
and why I
is.
love that quote, is that we have to be protecting the longevity of our equine athletes.
Exactly.
Georgie, I think for me, and I often use this as a point of reference when people ask about anti-doping, is to say horses have no voice. The SAEF is responsible for looking after sport horses in South Africa. So any horse that's registered with any of the disciplines or with the SAEF, therefore falls under our jurisdiction. And we are the person who is then their mouthpiece. And welfare of the horse is a huge concern for the SAEF. And then to say, would you allow your child, who is more or less in the same position as your horse,
I
to
like my
go and
horses a lot
compete?
more.
Sometimes. But would you allow your child to go and compete on high doses of even antibiotics? So if the doctor said, don't do any exercise being on this antibiotic, or don't do any exercise on this, would you allow your child to compete? And if you would, well, that's
I
questionable.
think
But most people wouldn't. Most people would say, no, it's not in the child's best interest to compete when
Absolutely.
it's high on ibuprofen.
Well, and they can't make a decision for themselves.
Exactly.
And you don't know what the ramifications are, frankly.
I think the other thing is, apart from the let's say it's, you don't have level playing fields, it is cheating, but there's a lot in the literature now of racing, particularly, I think a lot of research has been done in endurance, of working horses when they have problems and are lame with these catastrophic
Yes.
fractures.
And I suppose racing is just done more because they've got more money behind them.
So there's a real reason behind, these restrictions. You should not be doing that. It, from a point of view of the public, it's very devastating to see a horse having to be euthanized on track or falling and getting up with a broken leg, and it's unnecessary.
It's unnecessary.
Yeah.
That's really great. I think horse riders also are famously masochistic. So I know before I've gone to ride horses, and owners have said to me, no, pain is your friend. Like, pain is guiding you to not do something. And if you remove that barrier, you do it totally over exceed the potential of your body, I think. So can we discuss briefly, like, what kind of substances are banned? And again, just bearing in mind that obviously we know, or we might know what is and isn't, but for the lay person coming in, like...
Okay, so to put it very simply, a banned substance is a substance that has no part in, or should never be administered to a horse under any circumstances. And the only reason for utilizing or administering something like that is doping. So there's no therapeutic use of them.
Okay.
Your controlled medication is substances that are used normally. Horses deserve painkillers. They do need them when they cut themselves, or they bruise their soles, or something happens. They need certain antibiotics. They need local anesthetics. There's an awful lot of drugs that they need that are controlled, but they need them for their own welfare. The consideration here is that they're not allowed in competition because it could be giving the horse an unfair advantage. For instance, if your horse had a bruised sole and it was on an anti-inflammatory and didn't notice it, it might jump better. It's not in the horse's best interest because you might be doing more harm. So those are drugs that potentially could be abused in competition. So they are perfectly legal out of competition at home, but not when you are competing.
I think also if you're using them, there is a health problem that you're administering them for. So
Yes.
a healthy athlete
Yes.
is the only athlete that should be competing.
Exactly.
And what is a banned substance? Like, what is an example? And I don't want to use phenylbutazone because I know that is one that is being debated at the moment. But what is something that is completely banned across the board for equine athletes?
Shucks, there's so many of them. All your anabolic steroids
Okay.
are banned because they are used to, and the same would happen
With humans.
with humans.
Okay.
So your anabolic steroid. Morphine used to be, but it's now a specified substance. Synephrine was banned. It's now a specified substance. But most of them have to do with your human antidepressants are banned in competition horses. Well,
In horses?
Yes.
That's magical. I know so many horses that could benefit from an antidepressant, Sheelagh. They probably just need a half an hour in a paddock.
I
But
think they were all a lot happier during COVID.
I had so many horses that I was like, oh, are they okay? No, they're absolutely fine.
They're better
It's a bit
than before,
heartbroken.
yeah.
You mentioned synephrine, which I think is interesting because I know that synephrine was a trending topic with vaulting and show jumping in South Africa recently. Well, not recently now. Shows I'm getting on, but that falls under atypical findings. Or
Well,
did.
to start with, it was a banned substance.
Okay.
And when they banned it, it was, we suddenly had a whole lot of positives in the vaulting.
Okay.
It was
In South
2019.
Africa.
2019, correct. Then all of a sudden we were finding it in show jumping. And it was appearing in the food. So we don't know what specifically does. It's a, I think it's a cardiac stimulant. It does various things, but we didn't know where it was coming from. Testing the feeds, we were finding it in the feeds. And it is a product of citrus.
Oh.
So what do the farmers do before they sow their seeds is they put a herbicide down and they bind it with citrus oil
That's
to
incredible.
stay in the soil.
My God.
And obviously it goes into the soil and it's taken up by the plant.
Okay.
They had to raise the threshold levels,
Okay.
and the FEI won't disclose what those thresholds are, but they raised them.
Okay.
And it was particularly South Africa and Mexico that were the ones where it was found.
That's interesting.
And they did quite a lot of research on it,
Okay.
and to the extent that they found it in almost all feeds in that have been produced in South Africa.
And were other disciplines not affected, or were we not testing as stringently, I suppose?
In 2019, I don't think we had any
I
FEI
don't think we
eventing.
had a CDI.
We had one more endurance. So there was another positive
yes,
in
there was an
endurance. Yeah.
endurance.
So endurance, show jumping, and vaulting.
Yeah.
So that fell under, at the time, an atypical
No.
finding?
No,
No.
it
Okay.
fell under banned substance.
substance. And were they able to, I mean, that was quite an intensive process from what I recall about them petitioning to have that overturned.
It did, but they can only change this list format once a year,
Okay.
and there's a list group that decides on it.
Okay.
But with all the positives that had been that we had in all the tests, all our athletes were able to prove no fault and no negligence. And if you can prove that, the suspensions were lifted. But with a banned substance, a horse automatically gets a 3-month suspension. But they lifted it once they were able to prove that there was no negligence and no fault on their side. You will automatically, irrespective, unless now it's an atypical finding, lose your placings if you were the winner. Then what they've done is that they've introduced this new category that they call an atypical finding. They don't list it in the banned or the controlled medication list. It might be a specified substance. But when they find something that they suddenly find in a whole lot of, like we've had this Silpatrol, which has suddenly come up as a positive, they will list it as an atypical finding and go back to the person responsible and say this is an abnormal finding. It's not a normal thing that you would be giving your horse, and then try and find out how it came in. If that owner was able to go and test the feed and discover, for instance, Zolpatrol contaminated a truck that was, I think, for pig feed.
I can't. There are already so many variables in the stupid sport that we love. And now you
just to add to all
just
of that.
unlucky enough to get it. Okay.
And then they put a whole load of hay in it.
Okay.
So if they were able to prove that, the FEI would have removed any sanctions, so they would have withdrawn their case.
Okay.
And actually, they
That
wouldn't
seems
be
very fair then.
disqualified.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the only time they wouldn't lose their placings and they wouldn't be.
But that only came in 2020.
Yes.
So
Okay. I think it's really interesting.
No, I think
though.
it was 2021. So
no, it was 2020. It was 2020.
It's really in keeping. I mean, it seems to be like with WADA, which I know the FEI is aligned to. It's very, and anyone, I don't know if anyone's watched Icarus. It was a fascinating thing about human doping on Netflix, and they talk about how WADA is involved, but that's equine doping or international sport anti-doping seems to be very cutting edge, and they're constantly improving it. It's really fantastic.
And growing and moving. They have to. So as new information comes out, they change their rules.
And it's not to be jerks. It's to, keep the sport
Clean.
fair and keep the integrity of it.
Well, just as on the side of WADA and the FEI, where they're trying to detect these substances, on the other side are all these people who are developing new substances.
Yeah, absolutely. I read an interesting thing saying that South Africa has some of the best internet banking security because we have so many ingenious, criminals.
Yes,
that
we find ways to get around them.
I was thinking
But it's also why our tax law is so good.
Yeah,
because they keep on having to close all the loopholes that all the very ingenious people find.
Sheelagh, what is when people talk about the half-life of a drug and the full withdrawal period from the drug, what does that mean?
So half-life is usually used to talk about when you're administering something. And if you want to get a therapeutic level in an animal or in a human being, if its half-life happens to be 6 hours, and your therapeutic level sits at a certain point, after 6 hours, there's only half the drug left.
Okay.
And that threshold may be at that level. And what it indicates is you need to medicate again to push it above that level to maintain the level of that substance in the blood.
The efficiency as well
Yes.
of the drug. Okay.
So you don't want to be administering it every 12 hours when after 6 hours it's only at half the level. 6 hours later there's nothing left. You want to maintain that blood level.
Okay.
So it's not used so much in terms of doping. In terms of doping, the withdrawal period is, and we're really talking about administration of normal therapeutic substances.
Controlled medication.
Controlled
Yes.
medication.
So for example, a colic horse. I've got a colic horse and I
Yes.
call you to come out.
Yes.
And we'll discuss later on who the onus is on to make sure that the horse is given the right or legal medication. But I would need to tell you before you treated it so that I could make sure it was fully withdrawn by the time I go to compete at a show.
Yes.
Okay.
So I come out to your house today and your horse has got colic and you don't say anything to me and I don't know that you're competing. I will treat the horse with the horse's best interests in mind. If you say to me, I'm competing on Sunday, then the one drug I should try and steer clear of would be Phenidine, because Phenidine has a withdrawal period of 6 days.
Okay.
But I can use other drugs that have a withdrawal period of 48 hours or 72 hours. And there's enough time that you could compete on Sunday if I used those.
I think still also to the point of the welfare of the horse is assuming, as anyone who's had maybe a hangover or a tummy bug can attest to, your horse is maybe not going to want to be competing on Sunday anyway, but that's aside.
That's not
from
the
fact.
discussion
That's not
today.
the discussion. I'm just saying.
No,
You're
I
obliged to
think
say it, yeah.
Sunday, if it's very high level, I agree. But I mean, the worst is when it's 24 hours later. I don't think your horse should be competing at top level. But the idea is that if I use those drugs, so you've told me, so I will choose to use those drugs. If the horse doesn't settle, then the horse comes first. Then the horse is going to get the Phenidine if I deem it necessary.
Okay.
And then it's out of competition. But it is the person responsible's duty to tell your veterinarian, I've got a show this weekend. Because the vet doesn't know which shows each of their clients are competing.
No, of course not. And then moving on to, before you discuss with us what the ramifications are for horse owners caught doping, Sheelagh, are there ramifications for vets who are caught administering drugs with full knowledge of, so that are caught being part of a doping program?
Yes.
Okay.
So the FEI deems the person responsible, which is the rider. It's not necessarily the owner, as the person responsible for any doping transgression. or for any whatever's happening.
It's interesting. So it's even if the horse is in the care of the owner,
Yes.
it would still be up to the rider.
Yes.
I think that's sufficient motivation too.
But what they have are additional persons responsible.
Oh, okay.
So what they've now done is they've included in endurance, the trainer is automatically listed as an additional person responsible. So
Okay.
his license gets suspended.
Okay.
In vaulting, the longeur is an additional
that's
person
amazing.
responsible. So if in a hearing it comes to light that a veterinarian was administering the drug, they can also be an additional person responsible.
Okay.
If that person was an FEI veterinarian and was actually administering it at the event, they could then be removed from the FEI permitted list of treating vets or official vets.
And that means they can't treat at a show or be a.
They won't be able to officiate a show,
Okay.
and they won't be able to treat horses.
Okay.
There could be a disciplinary action for them, because as a veterinarian they should know the rules and regulations and they should be upholding them. Sometimes it could be inadvertent, it might be carelessness, and there might be a warning, but there could also be removal from the FEI list of veterinarians.
Okay. And then I was interested looking up on the FEI that there is actually, they have a list of suspended athletes and tribunal hearings on the website. What are the ramifications of being caught? Because I actually read an interesting, I can't remember what the exact Latin phrase is, but basically ignorance is not an excuse. It doesn't matter if you don't know that your horse is not allowed finidine. If you're caught with finidine, you stand to be suspended. You'll have if you do win the class, you'll have it taken away, etc.
So I think the first thing to say is you are, if you were going to play tennis, I love tennis, you would know what the rules of the game are. So you'd know that these are the boundaries. If I hit the ball over there, it's out. I don't get a point. If I hit the net, this is the consequences.
Unless you're John McEnroe.
But even John McEnroe, they have abuse of racket.
Really?
They do. Djokovic famously is always abuse of racket. But in horse riding, the same thing applies. So know the rules. And one of those rules is an anti-doping rule. They are published. They're easily accessible. So the FEI, with the app that you've got, you can easily see what substances are. And the FEI, as understanding as they are, and the SAEF would follow the same route, is to say, I understand that you might not have given your horse the medication, but you remain responsible for your horse. And whatever substance has been given to your horse, you remain responsible. So whether it was cross-contamination at the yard and some mistake, your horse got some kind of medication because the grooms were negligent in dossing out the medicine, the FEI says, SAEF says, we're very sorry, but you're still responsible. So as a owner, you need to, and as a responsible person, so either as the owner or as the person who rides the horse, you need to make sure that where there is in a yard where your horse is not the only horse and there are other horses, you need to make sure that whatever process is followed with regards to medication, that it's done in a way that is not negligent. And negligent is, the groom's dossing out the Previcox tablet and you crush it up and you put it in the horses and then they mix it with their hands and they go to the next horse's food and they mix with those same hands your horse's feed. So now there could possibly be contamination. There's no ways of telling which amounts. I mean, Sheelagh would know better than I do.
Came over,
But either way is to make sure that at the yard where your horse is kept, that the process that they have with following with medication is done really, really carefully. When you give food to the horse, make sure that you look at what substances are in the food. So I know there were cases on the FEI quite a long time ago where the substance, the prohibited substance, is listed on the food.
Okay.
So that's a case of looking at what you're actually feeding your horse to see what's in it that could possibly contain this prohibited substance. But the consequences are real. If you are tested positive, you will be disqualified. So disqualification is automatic. From the event. So the only time disqualification wouldn't happen is an atypical finding, but that means it's gone through an ATF panel, that we call that, and they've decided that there's no fault and you had no way.
If the rider disputes it.
No. So what happens with an ATF, I think if I can explain very briefly. So like Sheelagh explained, there are substances that are prohibited. So they're either banned or they're controlled that could enter the horse's system via contaminated food, So synephrine was one of them. I know caffeine is another one that's a specified substance. And often caffeine is found, I think, is it in molasses or coffee or a... It's possible for it to actually
Janine
get
and
into
Sheelagh,
the...
I know both of your horses, and I can't imagine ever giving any of them caffeine willingly. I mean, it's just a terrifying thought, I'm just saying.
Yes. So those specified substances, what would happen then is if your horse tested positive for a specified substance, you would get a notification to say that your horse is tested positive for a specified substance. You need to explain to us how this horse got Zilpatrol, or how this horse got caffeine, or how it got synephrine. So in the case with the vaulting and the show jumping and that, they all tested their grass. All their grass tested positive for synephrine, so it was quite easy to determine that. Then goes, yeah?
I'm just going to say with the Zilpatrol, we had one, and then suddenly the National Horse Racing Authority had a whole lot, and they put it out and warned everybody that maybe there was some contamination, and that's where they backtracked and they found the truck and what had happened.
Okay.
So it's the FEI or the SAEF would initiate that atypical finding, realizing that it is atypical, and they'd send it to the atypical panel. And they then would investigate and finally decide this is atypical, so it's no fault, no negligence, and withdraw the case or proceed with the case.
Okay.
So if the panel finds that it was an atypical finding, so an out of the ordinary finding, they would then say, and then there would be no consequences. It's as if the drug test had never happened.
Okay.
So there's no disqualification, no elimination, none of that happens. If, however, the ATF panel says, no, this is actually an adverse analytical finding, it then follows the next step, which happens
to... What is an adverse analytical?
So an adverse analytical says, well, it's just a term to say that it's not an ATF, which means now there is an automatic disqualification that happens of the results on that day.
So it's a prohibited therapeutic substance.
It's either, well, a prohibited substance is actually either banned or controlled. So if you look at the FEI's list, they're all prohibited substances.
Okay.
And under that, you would either have a controlled substance or you would have a banned substance. So as Sheelagh was explaining what the difference is between banned and controlled. So once an
if
adverse...
it's banned, the police just come and collect you immediately from your house, right?
Well, the consequences for banned is far worse because, like Sheelagh says, that is not meant to be anywhere close to a horse. So the fact that you've given that to the horse is a lot more serious than controlled medication, where we know that horses have received maybe medication because it was sick and they thought that the withdrawal period had happened.
So a rider could plead guilty and say, oh, I forgot.
Or actually, no, I did do it, but I thought that I was clear because it was 10 days ago or 7 days ago. And so that could happen. And so what happens with an adverse analytical is disqualification happens automatically. We follow the FEI's guidelines, and in terms of that, there's something called an administrative process, but it is only applicable to controlled medications, not to banned. And under that process, if that only is applicable if there's only one controlled medication that's been found in the horse's system, if this is the first time offence for you, or it could be that you had an offence but it was previous prior to 4 years. So as long as it's not within the last 4 years, and that the event that you were at where you were found guilty or where the substance was found was not an Olympic event or World Equestrian Games or something. So as long as those things are not there, you then are eligible for an administrative process. And that's almost like an admission of guilt. Okay. So you pay the fine, you're disqualified, you pay the cost of the test itself, and you walk away. And it's also not seen as a multiple offence, okay, which is quite important because obviously your first offence, if it's an administrative process, your name goes on the list, your horse's name goes on the list, and it stays there for 4 years. Sure. But the next time there's an offence within the next 4 years, it's as if that one isn't a multiple offence. So then it's almost as if this is the first one, but you won't then have access to the administrative process. Okay. So at the end of the day, you shouldn't be measuring. Oh, it's been 4 years. I can start
time for another one.
I can start my doping practices again. And that's the one process. If you then decide you don't want to follow the administrative process, one of the other options that you have, actually I should have mentioned it before, is you can ask for a B sample analysis. So in South Africa, if it was an FEI event, it goes automatically to the FEI lab in the UK, and they do the testing. And the testing costs roughly, which the FEI pays the cost of that until it's positive. Once it's positive, then it's your cost to pay.
With interest.
And that can cost, I think with the exchange rate, anything from 35 to 40,000 Rand.
Wow.
Okay, so in South Africa, we only have the one lab.
And it's because it has to be so controlled. I'm sure there's a chain of evidence.
In South Africa, we only have the one lab. It's the National Horse Racing Authority. If you, on a South African event, then say, well, I want my B sample tested, it can either get tested again by the National Horse Racing Authority, or you may decide to then send it to the UK, which means then you're going to be paying 40,000 Rand to get it to the UK to have it tested. If that comes back as positive also, you will still have the administrative process available to you if it was made available the first time around. Alternatively, you can say, no, I'm going to take my chance, tata my chance, and refer it to the Judicial Commission for a hearing.
And that's the SAEF Judicial Commission?
Or if it was an FEI event, then it would go to the FEI tribunal.
Okay. And just to be clear, these processes are available to everyone on the SAEF?
Yes.
It's readily available information.
One thing that I want to point out, and I constantly get telephone calls about, they send me a list of products, or they send me a list of photographs, and even list pages on products. It's been declared safe by the FEI. What I do want to say is the FEI will never say that a food additive or some homeopathic medicine that you're using, they will never declare it as safe.
Okay.
They don't. And they warn, there's a whole website where the FEI warn you about contaminations in what we call these nutraceuticals. And if you take the trouble to go and read the tribunal hearings, a large percentage of those
are nutraceuticals. So
are contamination in nutraceuticals.
Yeah.
So it's a genuine concern, because the process of producing them isn't so strict as in the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh.
And I mean, there were people who won badminton, and the drug, I think, was Reserpine, which is a human antidepressant, and it was a contamination in the line.
And that's horrifying too.
But they warn you about it, and again, people constantly phone me up and say it's got this and it's got that, and one of the problems is that they tell you a name, and on the FEI website it says, or its metabolites. So you need to know what some of these plants actually metabolize to.
Because I know devil's claw is the one natural thing that is banned, actually. Am I giving more grain?
I think it's, I think it is, but I'm not.
No, so I just think it's interesting, and I think what you're noting that people do need to be aware of is a lot of things masquerade under the natural label for humans as well, and people think that it can't possibly do any harm. But
FEI safe is a big seller.
Yeah, so don't trust when you see something and it says has been approved by the FEI as safe.
They don't.
They don't do that.
I think what you also both spoke to earlier on is the very real ramifications and holding one person responsible. And for someone who's a rider and doesn't own any horses, it's so easy to say, oh, I don't know, all my horses are stabled at different yards, they all have different grooms, I don't know what goes into the horse. And it's just making people be more accountable and invested and involved. And again, speaking to the overarching theme of the FEI, which I think is horsemanship, actually, and being invested and responsible in the day-to-day care. And
knowing the rules of the game.
Absolutely. And being, there's that lovely thing. I'm trying to think who it was. It was one of the classical trainers, and someone said, but it's not my fault my horse is doing this. And he says, well, whose fault is it? He says, well, the horse is getting too much food. He goes, who feeds the horse? It's not the horse. The horse isn't going there and dishing up its own food.
Well, it might be. If it's a pony, it might be helping itself.
Absolutely. And I thought it was so interesting. You're responsible for everything. If the saddle doesn't fit, if the shoes aren't, it comes down to you, to be the voice of the horse.
So I think also, Georgie, to note that, as Sheelagh mentioned, there are quite a number of people who could also be held responsible.
Totally.
So they're the automatic ones, like with regards to vaulting. But the owner itself could also be held responsible. So we said, yes, it's the person riding.
And then would any of their horses be banned if they're banned? No.
No. So, but the owner could be, so if you could say, Georgie, you ride for an owner, the horse is not stabled at your yard, you're not in control of what goes into that horse's body. You are still going to be responsible person. Your qualifications or the qualifications that you obtained are still going to be disqualified, but the SAEF or the FEI might decide to add the owner as an additional person responsible. And that could happen.
Some jet fuel in the horse overnight.
Somebody had to, it just needed a bit of extra today.
Totally. Sheelagh, where does training for vets because obviously we've just discussed how these protocols are changing constantly. Is there accessible training for vets to join? Do they have to partake special training to be aware of changes to drug legislation?
The FEI has a very good education system.
Okay.
And since I started, we would attend a course once every 4 years.
Okay.
And the whole theme behind it is that vets are on the same page and they react in the same way and they follow the rules and apply the rules in the same way. So from the point of veterinarians, it's actually quite onerous because you have to do online exams and the pass rate in some cases is 100%, so you can't get one question wrong. And you fail that twice and you're not allowed to redo it for like 6 months. So it's quite onerous. So there's online exams for permitted treating vets, for official vets, and then in all the different disciplines. The same applies to the stewards. They also have quite an onerous task in doing this.
FEI stewards.
Yeah.
And okay.
Yeah. So I think that system is very good, and I think the same applies in our country where we have a lot of veterinarians and a lot of disciplines that don't take place in the big cities. You think of tent pegging, you think of mounted archery, you think of saddle seat will probably bloom as their biggest show, but also Western mounted games. Those sort of things don't happen in Johannesburg and Pretoria. They happen in the rural areas because it's the farmers that are doing them. And we started off with developing and did a course for welfare officers. And the idea was that you can't have, and there are not sufficient vets, to have a vet at every event. But rather like the doping where you arrive unannounced, we would have officials that would go and check the playing fields are safe. They would look at passports. They would look at obvious faults in the tack or things so that we can upgrade everybody and we can also look after the welfare of the horse. That's the whole reason behind all these regulations.
So welfare officers are not a staple at every discipline SAEF show, but they can arrive. Can people contact a welfare officer if they're worried about a
Well, I
venue?
think the idea is to have a list on our website. So, and what areas they're in. So if a show in particular would want one, they could always contact one.
Okay.
And the idea is those welfare officers would also have a list of veterinarians that if they had a query, they could also contact.
Okay. So this will be across disciplines and across provinces,
Yes.
welfare officers.
Yes.
Okay.
But from the point of view of the FEI, you start off as a permitted treating vet. We request that you get a letter of good standing from council.
From the South African Veterinary Council. Okay.
Yes. And then you submit it to the veterinary committee. We do a round robin. Once you get accepted, you get access into the FEI where you do your test.
Okay.
And once you've done that
So
test,
any vets can do this if they.
once you get past the committee.
Perfect. Is the
And-
you said that in a way that made me feel.
I know,
like
so I was
it's
also
not a
quite
given.
nervous.
Okay. So we've got our welfare officers and our FEI treating vets.
Yes.
And those are the only vets that are permitted. If you're at an FEI show, I know you have to, for the dressage, if you're riding at a CDI, you have to check into the FEI stables.
Correct.
Your horse is not allowed to leave that unless it's going to the arena or for a walk. It's sort of supervised. Now, the only person permitted to treat at an FEI show
Is a permitted treating
would
vet.
be that vet. Okay. And
Well, you could have you could have your own personal FEI vet, but
Okay.
they would have to be registered as a permitted treating vet in order to access the stables.
Okay.
Now, the same doesn't apply with our national shows, and it would be very hard to enforce. But just as we have a panel of FEI vets, we would like to get a panel of SAEF vets
Okay, great.
that can help us at outline shows. And it's not going to be every weekend,
No.
but if we have enough vets, we can use them so that you don't have to send somebody at great cost to Uppington or something.
It also creates, again, a more equitable
Yes.
education, welfare, sporting structure, I suppose.
Yes.
So if there are any vets listening who want to find out about this, do they contact you, Sheelagh,
They can contact Robin
At the SAF, yeah.
at the SAEF? Okay.
We're going to, we have a development officer now, and we are going to be running some courses for SAEF vets.
Okay.
And you will then be registered, and you will get a little, what can I say, ID card that is yours, that you present at shows and entitles you to go to shows.
That's great. Yeah. Again, it's just a chain of accountability as well, I think. The welfare officers, who are those? How is it? Can anyone approach the SAEF to become a
We
welfare
ran,
officer?
I have a feeling it was 4 courses. We did 3 up here and 1 in George. And I think in total, we had approximately 30 people at each of them. A lot of them were already existing FEI stewards. A lot of them were judges. We had them from Botswana. We
That's
had them who
great.
came up from Port Elizabeth. And I think there must be about 90 of them. And this was probably in about
19, I think, or 18.
2018.
Yeah.
So we want to just do a refresher course,
Okay.
but then we want to utilize these people. They could easily be checking passports.
And,
They could
invite more
easily
people on board.
I mean, sometimes you go to a show and you see some really unsafe
Mm-hmm.
things, like the plough they used to
Harrow the arena.
harrow the arena, standing upright in the arena.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know,
Yeah.
runaway horse. So,
Yeah.
you know, sort of potential unsafe things that,
Okay.
that happen, because and it's not just the horse, it's the horse, it's the tack, but it's also the competition playing fields. They mustn't be detrimental to the horse that it can lead to harm or accident.
Absolutely. So we're looking for, so SAEF will perhaps run more of these courses and
Yeah.
prime opportunities for some parents to get involved, I'm sure. I think, I'm not being facetious, I think it's wonderful. We need to get more people involved in the sport, and the sport runs
On
so
volunteers.
much on volunteers. It really is essential. And we all love to, self-included, have a good moan about lack of welfare officers or something at a show. But I think the answer is to become one, you know, become part of the solution, not part
And
of
I
the
actually
problem.
think the welfare officers are paid, aren't they, Sheelagh?
Well, this was a big dilemma when we did it, because it was a question of who's going to pay them. My belief is that if SAF is going to use them,
Yeah.
SAF will pay them for what
So
they
I
ask
think
them
where
to do.
SAF sends them out, SAF does actually pay them. So if SAF says to a welfare officer in a region, we would like you to go to this show on the weekend, the SAF does actually pay the welfare officer to then attend the show.
Okay. We're winding down towards our last couple of questions. So I would just like to invite anyone who is listening, and I can see we've got some listeners, if they want to pop a question into the chats, please do so while we have Sheelagh here and not attending a colic or several other things at one time. Sheelagh also, we were discussing, is a marvelous maker of marmalade and chutney. She's going to be very upset with me for mentioning that.
Can I bring my stall next time?
Yeah, exactly. Fearless, like absolutely shameless panting. What treatments are allowed at shows? We were just discussing that FEI vets can come, but obviously sometimes people do call a vet to come to the for whatever. So like even at a normal national show, what are you allowed to call a vet to come there to treat? Sorry, we whipped Sheelagh out
I've
of.
got it.
A frog in her throat.
Oh,
It's quite suitable for a vet.
absolutely.
You can treat horses with, there's a list of things that you don't actually have to declare. So horses that are on ulcer medication, like omeprazole, is allowed at shows. You can use the homeopathic Traumel Zeal at shows. Quite a lot of antibiotics are allowed at shows. But the things that have to be injected, even be it homeopathic, have to be done by the permitted treating vet.
So if I decide to give my horse 2 ampules of Traumel and someone sees me doing it myself in the parking lot,
Then
that would be...
you would be had up as doping.
Okay.
Because it's not just the substance, it's also the methods. So you
It's
would
again a welfare issue.
you perform in a method that's prohibited.
Okay.
So they would have you up, just as you're not allowed to give anything rectally at a show. If they found
And I
you,
see that's a popular one at the moment. I didn't know that, is the Equine or
Yeah.
Equine suppositories, the joint.
and if you were found doing it at a show,
Okay.
the horse would be eliminated immediately,
Okay.
and you would be up for a prohibited method.
Okay.
So you need to be careful. You can't, just because it's allowed, do it. Even a veterinarian's not allowed to be doing administrative per rectum treatment at a show.
Okay.
I think actually, Georgie, a while ago, we put out on the SAEF page about shockwave therapy.
Yes, that was an interesting...
And then quite a lot of people had questions about shockwave therapy and why it wasn't allowed to be administered at shows. And maybe, Sheelagh, you could speak about shockwave therapy. I know, I remember a few years ago. Oh dear.
Sorry. It's okay. We've lost Sheelagh temporarily.
Um,
Does it speak again to any therapeutic treatments?
Well, actually, it's a prohibited method. So if you look at the vet regulations, it talks about what you may and what you may not do at shows like Sheelagh was talking about. And shockwave therapy is one of the things you can't do at an event. And I think there's a certain period before an event that you also
I think
can't do it.
It was within 3 days of...
Exactly. And the reason I know with the shockwave is we all went onto the website to then find out why. And it's actually because it has almost like a numbing effect on the horse. So a horse that is...
Is it not allowed for people as well? I just...
Well, I was just thinking, if anti-doping happened with all the humans sitting on the horses, and I know a lot of equestrians' breakfast is cataflam.
Cataflam and antidepressants. I mean, this is
So
their target
I'm
market
just
for the
saying,
pharmaceutical
if we were
companies.
tested, but so the shockwave therapy, and that is why it's not allowed. So you have a horse that is potentially not feeling good, is maybe a little bit unsound or not feeling good, and you then do the shockwave therapy, you could be numbing that. And then the horse could appear absolutely fine at the show where the underlying conditions that have caused the pain are still there.
Okay.
So I think that's just one of the things Sheelagh was just saying about the shockwave therapy and why it's not allowed at shows, or I think it's 2 or 3 days before.
But
5 days.
Is it 5 days? Yeah. And we were just discussing the reasons because
it is mask pain.
yeah, and that's
I see lots of things like beamer blankets out at shows. And are there any of those things that horse owners, riders need to be aware of?
There's a list of non-supportive therapies.
Okay.
So there's a lot of things that can be done by the person responsible and the owners in the stable.
Okay.
Then there's a list of supportive therapy, which have to be done by the permitted equine therapist.
Oh, okay. Like
So there are certain things that they can do. You can do acupuncture, but it has to be done by a permitted treating vet.
okay.
So we have in this country somebody who does do acupuncture, and he became a permitted treating vet.
Okay.
Otherwise, he had to have me watching him do it.
Oh, okay. All right.
But it's so there's a list. I can't remember
Okay, no, that's
each and
fine.
every one of them.
But it
and-
is readily available for everyone. And
yes.
so I was going to say it's on, if you look at the veterinary regulations, which are on the SAF website, and you look specifically in chapter 5, which deals with veterinary medications, and it talks about equine prohibited substances list, treatments before and during an SAF event, emergency treatments, controlled medication forms, treatment with non-oral medication and therapies, prohibited treatments, so the use of banned substances is always strictly prohibited. And then it talks about in chapter 6, supportive therapies. So these are the therapies that Sheelagh was talking about. And it gives you a very clear list of what is allowed and what's not allowed and who has to do it and who can do it at a show, who can't do it at a show. And I think, again, as a responsible owner or rider, you need to be aware of this so that you don't pitch up at a show with your shockwave gun, hitting your horse's bum.
I mean, you can, for instance, you can use ice boots,
okay.
but you can't use ice boots that reduce the temperature to below 0.
Okay.
because ice is a very potent anti-inflammatory, and if you cool something that low, it's not going to feel any pain.
That's interesting.
So there are regulations about what you can and can't do.
Yeah. So it's just go and have a look at them.
I'm looking at the website link now. It's really comprehensive, and I see links out to all of the FEI clean sport initiatives as well. So that's really great.
Yeah, I don't think you have, as a responsible rider or owner, you have no reason not to know. Be informed, educate yourself.
And again, just stressing that the onus always comes down to the own. Well, I don't want to say to the owner or to the rider. I think it's a joint effort, really, with these
Very much
horses,
so.
to discuss with the vets. When they're having treatments around a showtime, and obviously there've been incidences recently where riders weren't allowed to compete at an event after finding out that they'd vaccinated within a threshold level. So,
well, I think what people forget, and I know there was a lot said at the time, is that those rules are there for the welfare of the horse. And the reason behind that is that, and it's probably less likely the older the horse is and less likely the more times it's been vaccinated. But the reason there is that horses can react to vaccinations, and you really don't want to be traveling with it and going to compete in a big show. So it's there to safeguard the horse. And you should be aware of it. I mean, it's not there to be nasty.
well, this is I think the point is that we're ultimately, none of us is doing the sport for fame or fortune, So the love of the horse should really be a primary driver here. And if the National Federation has to step in and enforce that, then so be it. But I do think the call to arms, as it were, is for every horse rider to remember to do what's best for their horse at the end of the day, and to not get their vet fired. Just saying.
Or not get fired by their vet.
True. That's more dangerous.
I receive a lot of calls all the time about the rules and regulations, and I'm always willing to help.
But they are readily available on the website.
They are, and one of the things that I know no more than you do is when I get a whole lot of things that says FEI safe and it's some joint something or whatever. I don't.
That's so cheeky to go and use that. That's magical.
But it's the same as when people say it's FDA approved. In America, it's FDA
but this is
approved.
the problem with nutraceuticals, right? Is they don't have to go through any Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah, so even in South Africa, they don't go through the Medicine Control Council.
No, they don't. But there are some regulations, feed and additives. There is a legislation, but it's still.
But I also think that, like you were saying, the contamination could be as a result of a line contamination, not actually putting the product in. So they're not actually adding a prohibited substance to the supplement, but their line could be contaminated because they produce something else with that product.
Well, they haven't done the sterilization, the cleaning in between producing that product
and the next one,
and then the next one.
So that's why it's not so safe.
There was a very funny thing, obviously, when the COVID vaccines were coming out, and people were saying, "Oh, we don't know what's in the COVID vaccine." And I saw one of my favorite comments was, "I've seen you eating McDonald's. Don't pretend you know what's in that."
Or what's in polony.
Let us not forget the polony crisis in South Africa of whenever it was 2019 as well. It was like, and everyone was just going, everything's trying to kill us, even the polony. That's great. Is there anything else either of you want to add to that?
No.
Sheelagh?
I don't think so. I think the one thing, and I think I don't want people out there to be frightened to go to a horse show, frightened to do anything because of all the things we say. These rules are there to safeguard the horse, and they're not there to make people's lives unpleasant or unbearable. It's a sport. Go out and enjoy it, and go out and enjoy it with your horse.
I think the other thing also is, and obviously I'm not talking about the average rider going to a lovely Sunday show with their horse, but I read a very interesting study on urectomies in horses, and saying that the danger to the riders in these situations is enormous. When you've actually removed any feeling in a horse that is pain compromised, I hadn't thought about that. The knock-on effects are huge, and so many things can happen. And I think a lot of the time it's not necessarily that people are going out with a mind even to do as you say, to do something terrible to their horse. They love their horse. They want to enjoy their sport. It's just not knowing what could happen.
I think, Georgie, you remember a while ago there was, and I think it came out after the Olympics with Simone Biles, who said she wasn't going to compete in gymnastics. And there was a reference of a German gymnast, Russian gymnast,
The Russian girl who
who
broke her
had
ankle.
she had broken her ankle at some stage, and despite that, and she had been healed but not fully healed, and she wasn't 100%. And despite that, her coach basically said, "You will go, you will compete, and you will do this." And she did, and she broke her neck, and she was paralyzed. And that's why pain is your friend. And in the case with a horse, who you're now masking that pain. The catastrophic injuries are real, not just for the horse, but for the rider. You're jumping 1.40 meters, 1.50 meters, something seriously goes wrong with your horse. You're sitting on top of that horse, eventing is even worse.
I don't know why we're pretending that jumping is the only dangerous sport. I've been walking on horses and been terrified for my life. So I just want to say that horses are, it's like, I loved the discussion last week where someone said bomb-proof horses, and someone said there's no such thing. We're sitting on flight animals, they're prey animals waiting to die. But again, I think it can happen anywhere, is what I want people, and it can happen in a pony at 60 centimeters or during Gymkhana, or, so really we need to be so mindful of this. Obviously, the high impact sports or high speed sports are way more vulnerable to these impacts, I suppose.
And I also think maybe the injuries are more possible with jumping versus if the horse is just
Impact.
walking.
I think,
So any impact
also
kind of.
with the venting, because when you race in on a racetrack, it's flat.
Yeah.
It might be heavy going, it might be, sort of perfect going, but it's pretty flat. When you're in a show arena, you're on a prepared surface. When you go out eventing, unless you're venting overseas where they've got lovely rolled lawns, here
And even then, I mean, Burley's just happened. They were appalling falls.
Yeah.
it's across country. So you need a horse that knows where it's putting
And sure-footed,
its feet. And one of the terrifying things is that if you did, and one of the other and I'm talking a little aside, is that sometimes when you do a neurectomy, it's very hard to determine, and the horse can regenerate some sensation. But let's say it's on the phase that it doesn't know where it's putting its feet. You could promote a rotational fall in the country, and when that horse does that, it could kill the rider. And so, that reason behind it is really to protect the rider and the sport.
And again, I just really loved what you touched on in the very beginning, that when it's not here to be a big stick, it's here to promote safety and integrity of the sport, the equine athletes and the human athletes. But to your point, it's trying to be a voice for the horse. And let us never forget that's...
Well, I think if you look at any of the regulations, even if you look at the Constitution, one of the first things that it always talks about is the code of conduct for the welfare of the horse. It's in the vet regs, it's in the general regs, it's everywhere. And that is why the SAEF is there, is to protect the horse and be the voice of the horse. The same way I imagine the SPCA would be of all animals. We are saying sports horses are our domain.
Your comment about the SPCA is very pertinent, because we need to be seen within ourselves and to the general public to be looking after the horse, because there's a worldwide move to ban equestrian sport from international playing fields and from the Olympics.
Absolutely.
Based on
under
the
massive
abuse
scrutiny.
of the whole battery. But I mean, so we need to police ourselves, and we need to be clean, and we need to be aware and look after the welfare of the horse.
Absolutely. I think
Actually,
that's really valid.
Hasn't the FEI just recently, I think the poll is finished now, the survey is finished, the FEI,
Yes.
and it's regarding the welfare of the horse.
Exactly.
And because the FEI takes it very seriously, and rightfully so.
There was a lot of, unfortunately, at the Tokyo Olympics with the pentathlon.
Yes.
Of course.
But you see it everywhere. People with cell phones take a quick thing, and then it's on YouTube. Then it disseminates everywhere.
No, I think that's really valuable, and I do think actually videoing thing that we should get Emma Sadler in here to discuss on social media, and just people being aware of it.
Actually, it's a really good topic to discuss.
Yeah. Also, if you're not doing anything bad, you don't need to worry about who takes out a video. But
Yeah, but the public eye is always, and actually, I think
Absolutely.
even in general in South Africa now with the live feeds, when we get to watch, so we had COVID and we couldn't watch, and then all of a sudden we've had them doing live feeds, and you can watch live streaming horse riding everywhere in the world, but even in South Africa. And so there's always a camera on you, just.
I
So
think
yeah,
pentathlon, the equestrian phase has been removed from
It has been,
pentathlon
yeah.
now.
It has been.
Thanks to the German rider.
I'm not too sure whether it isn't still in the 2024, but it's out of 2028.
Okay, that's interesting. It's going to be so, and rightfully so. It's going to be so.
It was
so
horrific
But I
to
think-
watch.
I think the reminder, and I think a lot of it was taken incorrectly, is that the pentathlon athletes are not equestrians. sportsmen.
No,
They don't ride as it's just one of the
I do think that became very apparent very quickly in that arena, Sheelagh.
Yeah.
But yes, it was also a very nice thing to watch with all my non-horsey friends who say, "You just sit there."
No, you don't.
I had to watch a German woman weeping at the Olympics. Tell her, go phone her, tell her she just sits there. Glorious. Thank you both so much for joining us here tonight.
Thank you for having us, Georgie.
It's always exciting. Thank you, Sheelagh. So anybody who's looking for more information, please follow the link. It's there in our comments. It will be in the body of the chat when we post this to our YouTube feed. That is on the SAEF website. If you look under Clean Sport, there are numerous links there to assist you, to educate you. Remember that the onus is on you to be educated. The education is provided. But if you do have any questions, I think our resident vet, please don't phone Sheelagh. She will blame me. Don't do it unless you're going to buy her marmalade and her chutney. That's all you're allowed to do. But the SAEF is here for the riders. It's here to help everyone in the sport, notably the horses. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them a line if you can't find the answers that you're looking for. Otherwise, have a good evening, stay safe, stay clean, and please tune in next week, Wednesday, for our next podcast.